Good afternoon, everyone. So, welcome to the next lecture for our subject research in daily life. Now that you have already established your background of the study, you have already constructed your review of related literature. This time, we will be having research methodology, wherein we have to identify the research design, your targeted respondents, your target samples, your instrumentation, and how we are going to proceed with data collection and analysis. Now, for our session learning targets, at the end of this session, you will be able to choose appropriate qualitative research design and identify various types of sampling techniques and qualitative data collection methods. First, let's try to find out the concept of constructing research design. Now, research design is like a puzzle because it is composed of several pieces from your earlier chapters, such as your research questions, your literature review, your research approach, even the data collection methods and the data analysis methods. All of them should be incorporated in this chapter and they should be able to address one another. So in that way, they must be aligned, they must be linked with one another. They must be anchored with one another. Now, the following sections of your chapter 3 should include the research design, the sampling technique, the research instrument, the data gathering procedure, and of course, the data analysis. So in this lecture, I'll be discussing Roman numerals 1 and 2, which are research design and sampling technique. Now, let's try to look at an example that I have here. It comes from a previous research conducted by my previous students from ABM. So let's try to figure out how they wrote this section of chapter 3. Now, looking at the example, the writer included the type of research and a short description of what it is. And at the same time, the writer included how is the chosen type of research appropriate to their respective study. Okay? So very short and very direct to the point. All you have to do is indicate what type of research are you employing. Of course, that will be qualitative research. And according to this example, they use phenomenology as their research design. Phenomenology is an example of a qualitative research design wherein phenomenology explores the experiences of your respondents, the behaviors, even their points of view regarding a particular phenomenon. So, for example, if you're talking about advantages and disadvantages of online selling amidst the pandemic, that will fall under phenomenology as a qualitative research design. So, in short, you may use phenomenology as your research design when you make your chapter 3. Okay? Now, in the second paragraph, if we look at the example, the writer discusses how appropriate is qualitative research design to their study. Okay, so if you look at the construction, it's very short, very direct to the point. Okay, so I don't need you to explain very much um, this section. Okay, all you have to do is indicate what type of research design are you going to use, and at the same time, I want you to state how is that type of research going to be appropriate for your entire research study. Now let's have another example. So very short. Again, the writer used qualitative as their research design. So he or she mentioned the importance or a short description of qualitative research and how would it be appropriate to their study. So that's just how you write research design as one of the sections of chapter 3. Now we move on to the sampling techniques. Now when we say sampling techniques, it is the method or process of selecting respondents or people who will answer questions meant to yield data for your research study. Okay, so when we say sampling techniques, these are the methods that we use by which we select respondents. The manner of selecting our respondents would refer to what we call sampling techniques. Now, sampling techniques can either be probability or non-probability. Now, before we move further to that, I want you to remember some important terms when it comes to sampling techniques. We have here sample, population, and the sampling frame. So, how are these terms different? When we say sample, we are actually talking about the chosen subjects or your chosen respondents, selected respondents. When we say population, it is bigger than the sample because when we say population, we are talking about the bigger group where our chosen samples belong. Okay? Now, the sampling frame, it is the list of members of such population from where you will get the sample. So let's try to illustrate these terms. So I have here example. For example, our population would be Pateros Catholic School Senior High School. That will be our population where we will get the sample. Now the sampling frame would also be possible to say PCS senior high school students. So that's the sampling frame within the population. Now, the sampling frame is where we will get the chosen samples or the respondents for your research. So if PCS senior high school students will be our sampling frame, therefore, our chosen sample would come from that frame. So for example, we will have grade 12 STEM students. So that's how the three terms are different. A population is the biggest number. Sampling frame would mean a particular group from that population where we can select the samples. Now the sample is what we call the selected respondents. Okay. Now, most of the time, when it comes to qualitative studies, we are using purposive or judgmental sampling. What do we mean by that? Purposive or judgmental sampling relies on the decision of you as a researcher in choosing or selecting your respondents. Okay, so when we say purposive, when we say judgmental, it depends on the decision. It's the sole discretion of you as a researcher. So kayo na yung pipili kung sino yung respondent. Hindi na kayo mag-draw lots, hindi na kayo mag-random sampling. Pag sinabi natin purposive or judgmental, you are the ones who choose your respondents. Maybe because these respondents are chosen because they have rich experiences regarding your topic, or maybe they have expertise, they have the necessary expertise needed for your data in your research. So you chose them purposively, judgmentally speaking, something like that. Okay? Now, sampling in research can be probability or non-probability. Okay, so when we say probability, all members of the population have the equal chance to be selected as your respondents. When we say non-probability, not all members of the population have the equal chance because, number one, it depends on you as a researcher. Number two, it also depends on the availability of the respondents, or it may be about the purpose of your study. That's why you will use non-probability. Now, obviously, for qualitative research, we will be using non-probability sampling, which is purposive or judgmental sampling. But of course, let us try to be familiar with the different sampling techniques that we can actually use in any type of research. Let's start with the probability sampling techniques. We have here simple random sampling and systematic sampling. Okay, when we say simple random sampling, it is the basic sampling technique wherein all the members of the population have the equal chance or opportunity to be selected as your respondents. Okay, so it depends entirely by chance. Okay, so for example, draw lots. Okay, you list all the members, the names of the members of of the population, and then punutan. So that will be simple random sampling. What else? You may assign a number to each member of the population. That's yung number yung i-draw lots nyo. That would also fall under simple random sampling. Systematic sampling is similar to simple random, kaya lang meron siyang sinusunod na interval or meron siyang sampling interval. For example, I have a population of um, 1,000 students, and then I will use systematic sampling. For example, the sampling interval would be every fifth in the list. Okay? So, paano siya naging systematic? Susundin natin yung sampling interval na every fifth in the list. So, for example, if I have a list of 1,000 members of the population, every fifth ang susundin ko, ang pipiliin ko. So, that will be the fifth in the list, the 10th in the list, the 15th in the list. So, may interval kung sino pinipili mo. Okay, so that will be systematic sampling. Under probability sampling, we also have stratified sampling and cluster sampling. When we say stratified sampling, you as a researcher, you are the one who divides the population into separate groups called strata. For example, I will be dividing them according to age, according to gender, according to grade level. Those categories will be referred to as strata. Okay? Now, the strata is formed based on the some common characteristics of your population members. Okay, yun nga, based by age, by religion, by hair color, eye color, pwedeng ganon. That will be considered as stratum or strata. Okay? Now, after you divide the population into various strata, that's the time you randomly select the sample proportionally. Pag sinabi natin proportionally, for example, you need five samples from each strata. So, ibig sabihin, pipili ka ng 5 members of the population from each strata. Kaya siya dapat proportional. Okay? Stratified sampling ang tawag doon. So, we divide the population into different groups. These groups can have common characteristics, and once you divide them into groups or strata, that's the time we select random samples proportionally. Cluster sampling will be different because cluster sampling, you are able to create multiple clusters of people from a population where they are indicative of similar characteristics and have an equal chance of being a part of the sample. For example, I want to find out the um, the college degrees of students, of college students in NCR. Okay, so for example, um, i-divide since NCR has 17 cities, pwede ko silang i-divide into cluster according to its geographical location. For example, the northern cities, the southern, the eastern, and the western. So I will be having four clusters. Right? And then from each cluster, I will be selecting randomly samples for my study. Okay? Now we move on to the types of non-probability sampling. When we say non-probability, it's kind of biased already. Kasi kanina, si probability, all the members have the equal chance. Therefore, you are being unbiased when it comes to selecting respondents. This time, when we use non-probability sampling, we are actually being biased in selecting our respondents. Number one, maybe because you already know who your respondents will be, so that's why you are the one who chose the respondents as researchers, or it may be because the respondents are already available at the time of your interview or at the time of your survey. So even without having to meet criteria, they become your respondents. So that could also fall under non-probability sampling, or it depends on the interest needed for your study or the purpose of your study. Now, for the first two types of non-probability, we have here quota sampling and voluntary sampling. When we say quota sampling, it involves knowing the characteristics of the target population. So you choose sample members that possess characteristics to be involved in your study. If they do not meet those characteristics or those criteria, then they won't be qualified. They won't be selected as your respondent. So they must meet several characteristics or criteria. That's what we call quota sampling. Voluntary sampling, very easy. There's no need to do any selection process because the respondents themselves volunteer to be respondents of your study. Kaya siya voluntary sampling. Purposive and availability, so ito yung sinasabi ko, most of the qualitative studies will employ purposive or judgmental or selective sampling. Okay? It relies on you as a researcher. It relies on your own judgment kung sino yung pipiliin yung member. So, um, what is something very important that you should consider when you use purposive sampling? Dapat alam nyo na kung sino yung tatargeting yung respondents. Especially, the level or the degree of their experiences and expertise. Yun yung lagi kong sinasabi. Kapag gumamit tayo ng purposive sampling, dapat pag ang pipiliin natin respondents, either maraming experience regarding your topic or malawak yung expertise niya regarding your topic. Yun lang naman yung two factors kaya tayo gumagamit ng purposive sampling. Okay? Pinili natin sila kasi alam natin na they have the experience and they have the expertise in answering your interview questions, in answering or in discussing your research topic. Kaya purposive sampling ang fit sa ating qualitative research. Okay? Now, availability sampling, also known as convenience sampling, kung sino yung available during your data collection, then they can be considered as your respondents. For example, nag-survey na ako ngayon, pumunta ako sa labas ng bahay, sa street namin. Kung sino yung mga nasa street namin na available that time during my survey, edi sila na yung magiging respondents doon. That is what we call convenience or availability sampling. What else? Nag-post ka ng Facebook poll, Facebook question, or Facebook poll, yes. So, in a way, nagiging convenient sampling siya kasi nga, anyone who has the free time na nag-browse sa Facebook can answer the poll. Okay? For example, kung sino yung maabutan mo sa isang room, na free sila that time, then, right there and then, you can use the principle of availability sampling. Sila na yung magiging respondents mo. The last type of non-probability is what we call snowball sampling or chain sampling. So just like snowball, parami ng parami yung respondents mo. How do we do that? For example, I select only 5 respondents, and then itong mga 5 respondents na to, they will be recruiting other respondents from their maybe friends, from their acquaintances, from their other classmates, from their relatives. Kaya nag-expand yung number ng respondents natin, like snowball. Okay, that is what we call snowball sampling. Okay? Now, let's try to understand an example here how the researcher wrote that section of sampling techniques. So, if you look closely at the example, the writer indicated directly the point, they indicated what type of sampling will the research use. So, non-probability. And then, in-specify niya anong type ng non-probability, purposive. And then, in-explain niya bakit purposive. Okay? And then, the writer also stated very briefly the nature of purposive sampling. Pwedeng ganyan. And then, the writer also included the quantity, the total number of target respondents, and from where. So, nilagay din niya yan dyan sa part na yan. So, that is how you write this section, sampling technique. Let's have another example. So, 2 paragraphs, pero very direct to the point, very short. So, lagi niyong uunahin, anong type ng probability, anong type ng sampling, probability or non-probability, and then what is specifically. So, go direct to the point, and then after that, you can elaborate your sampling techniques by stating how many target respondents will you have, by stating from where will the sample come from, pwedeng ganon, okay? So, i-mention nyo lang kung ilan at taga saan sila at bakit sila yung napili, bakit purposive, ang gagamitin, why is it appropriate for your study. Yun ang ilalagay nyo sa section na ito. Okay, so that will be your group activity. You will be writing the first 2 sections of your chapter 3, which are research design and sampling technique. Now, for the research design, 3 to 5 sentences will do. Now, these are some guide questions that you may include when you discuss this part of chapter 3. What research design will you use? How is the research design appropriate to your study? So, kahit yung dalawang guide questions na lang yan, it can guide you in constructing research design. Now, for the sampling technique, I will be requiring you to have 5 to 7 sentences. These are the guide questions that you may include in discussing this section. What is your sampling technique? How appropriate is the sampling technique in your study? Who are your target participants and how many? Describe their characteristics as respondents and their natural environment or setting as well. So, ganyan lang kasimple yung dalawang unang section ng chapter 3 natin. Okay, in the next lecture, I will be discussing the research instrument kasi medyo mas comprehensive yung research instrument as well as the data gathering procedure and data analysis method. Okay, so thank you so much for staying with me, for listening. So I hope you can apply some concepts here that are very, very important in constructing your own chapter 3 of your research.